This is Talking Rackheads. Hi, I'm Nigel from The Art of Sound, and this is Talking Rackheads, episode number 11. Now, before I begin this episode, I just want to thank everybody who's given such great feedback, comments and critiques, and especially to the subscribers, because when I started this channel, I sort of thought we might get maybe 50, 100 subscribers at most, and last week we actually reached over 500 subscribers, which to me is amazing and very unexpected. I know in the great scheme of things, you know, for a lot of channels, 500 subscribers is nothing. But trust me, for a channel that's dedicated just to one particular subject, in essence, well, 500 subscribers for me is pretty outstanding and really, really appreciated. It's you guys that inspire me to keep making these episodes and keep exploring VCV Rack on your behalf and seeing what we can come up with. So really and truthfully, thanks everybody. I'm not sure you guys realize how much it means to me, but it really does. So anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with episode 11. Now, the feedback I got from episode 10 when I started this build a patch method for showing you how I build parts of patches and put them together and so on was incredibly positive. And so because of that, I'm going to carry on with that in this episode, and we may actually carry on again for another 2 episodes doing this. We'll see how much material I can come up with. But what we're going to do in this episode is just carry on showing you how I build patches, how I put together voices, the sort of techniques that I've used over the years with hardware that I'm now translating into VCV Rack, and hopefully some of you will find it interesting, be it beginners or the more advanced amongst you. I hope all of you get something from it. And also, I'm going to say something which is slightly controversial, but it's okay. I often get asked, you know, because I started in the world of modular with hardware, how I'm getting on with my hardware racks now VCV is available. And the truth is, I'm not using the hardware that much these days. I'm finding that I much prefer to do everything in software. Now, that doesn't mean to say my hardware racks are ignored. They're not. I do use them in the studio and out on the road. But I have to be honest and say that probably 80% of my building these days is done in VCV Rack, simply because I enjoy it so much. And also, for what is free software that's still in beta, it's amazingly stable and actually quite reliable to use. I'm not having any major issues with instability. I took it on the road with me last weekend to a private gig and did a whole gig of songs for about an hour and a half, and the thing was rock solid. So, you know, Andrew and the rest of the team, thanks so much. I mean, it's incredible. So, anyway, there you go. That's my opinion. I actually believe that VCV Rack, for me at least, is the way to go in terms of creating modular music. And the more I use VCV Rack, it seems the less I'm using my hardware Euro racks. Not sure what I'm going to do with the whole 20 or 30,000 bucks worth of hardware I've got. I mean, I'm sure it'll still get used, but the reality is, as each week passes, the more I'm using the software compared to the hardware. And I will say that I'm also using them in conjunction with each other. So, you know, there will always be a use for hardware. The hands-on tweaking is amazing. But, you know, that's how it is. Anyway, let's get on with this episode. And what I've done here is I've created a patch that's made up of several components, all of which I'm going to go into and explain how and why I created them. And this is sort of like a mini patch. So I'm just going to play a part of it so you can hear it for a few minutes, and then I'm going to break it down and show you how I put it together. So that is the basic patch that we're going to be working on for the first part of this episode of Talking Rackheads. And what you're looking at the moment is the bass part, one of the bass parts of that sequence. Now, there's actually in the whole patch, there are really only 2 sequences playing, plus a bass drum. Even though it sounds like there's more than that going on, in reality it really is only 2 sequences, and what we're looking at is the bass sequence here. So what I've done is I've taken a PS16 and I've programmed a series of notes in steps of 8. So it's an 8-step sequence. If I press the length button, you'll see it's 8 steps. And that loops round at the end of 8 steps. And what I've done is clocked this so it's basically playing 1 step every 8 beats. So that means that when the bass drum plays on the beat, then this will change from each step every 8 bass drum beats. And then what I've done from there is taken an output from the volt per octave or CV output of the PS16 and fed that here. As you can see, this goes up to a Bog Audio stack. Now, why am I using the stack? Well, the stack has got lots of different uses, but one of the main things I use it for is to transpose patches, sequences if you like. And there is a CV input here that's quantized. So when you send it notes from a sequencer, it actually takes the input, the volt per octave input, and outputs the volt per octave with the addition of the notes here to transpose the sequence. So initially this PS16 is working as both the transposer for the fast playing sequences and also providing the bass note for the bass part down here. And if I take the volt per octave here, you can see that this chord goes to the output of this Bog Audio stack here. Now notice there's no input here. I'm not using the volt per octave input on the Bog Audio stack. What I'm doing instead is letting the Bog Audio stack just play 1 note, basically the root note of the chord, and I'm using the output from the phrase 16 playing different notes to transpose the output of this. And this is one of the great uses I find for the stack, is that you don't need to feed it a volt per octave input. You can just let it produce the bass tone itself, and then use the CV input, which transposes the basic tone, the pitch that this thing generates, to change the output pitch from the stack going into your volt per octave. Now that sounds quite complicated, and I realise that, but if I play this patch, you'll actually hear just this bass part, and this is one of two bass parts. So these three modules here, GrainOSC, the new Ferox from Volt, which I absolutely love, which is a CMOS filter, and Volt's slap envelope, that's going to be playing just the lower bass part, which sounds like this. That's a really atmospheric, thumpy sort of bass sound. And what I've done is I've used the seesaw waveform, which is the basic waveform based on the CS80 from GrainOSC, and I've changed the color and the modulation a little bit here to make it really rich and deep. Then I'm using the Ferox itself with a lot of cutoff being generated from the envelope, as well as the bite function being controlled by the envelope, and that gives it that whap sound, which is really important. But I'm also using the built-in envelope, this thing here which says J/VCA. I'm using that built-in envelope of the cornrows itself with a very slow attack and a long decay to create the whap sound that it generates as well. So this envelope is not only controlling the filter and the volume of the cornrows, but the cornrows' own envelope inside is also working on that sound too. So the two together give that sort of big brassy brap sound that I really wanted to get from this GrainOSC for the lowest bass part. I've also put on a heck of a lot of reverb in there to really give it that atmospheric, dense, sort of deep sound. And again, if I carry on playing, you'll hear it. And it's almost like a sort of echo effect as it bounces around in the room. And that room size is set quite big in the reverb to give it that sort of like dense, sort of echoey, I'm in the middle of a big sort of cave type thing. And you notice with the envelope, I've set the envelope to have a very long attack and quite a lot of decay, only sort of like a small amount of sustain and again a long release. But I'm using the hard mode. This means that these envelopes are really quite short in reality. The main envelope is coming from here, plus the reverb to stretch the sound out. And as with always with these patches, I will be releasing this whole patch as part of the patch pack, so you can experiment with this yourself. But there is one thing that's quite important to note, and that is I'm using Regate here from AS. Now, why am I using that? Well, I'm using the Master Clock ×4 from MSC Hack. And if you remember last time, I was talking about different clocks generate different types of triggers and gates. And some clocks generate very short triggers and not full width gates. And when they do that, envelopes don't trigger as you expect, because basically the trigger that's coming from the clock isn't enough to trigger the entire attack portion of an envelope. So what typically happens is, unless you keep the attack at 0, you'll get no sound because the envelope is never triggered. So what I've done here is taken the gate output from the PS16, which is being generated by the trigger coming from the master times 4 clock, and fed that into the input of the regate, and then the output of the regate is going to the gate input of the envelope, and I've stretched or modified the gate itself. So instead of just being the little short clock or trigger that comes input, when it outputs, it's a much longer gate that gets output. So therefore the envelope triggers correctly as I would expect. And again, this is something to play with. If you're having problems with envelopes not triggering because of the type of clock or gate you're using, then fit in a regate from AS in between the output from your gate or whatever from your sequencer, and then take the output of that and feed that to the gate of the envelope or whatever else you're using, and change the length. Use this control here, and you've got a short or long type of gate here that you can change just by clicking on it like this, and give it a long gate, and notice the difference of how the envelope behaves. It really does make a huge difference. So I'm using regate to sort of correct the behavior of the triggers coming from the master clock times 4. And you know, sequences, some of them, not all, but some, they just pass through whatever trigger or gate they receive. They pass through their own gate output, which is actually the right way of doing it, because there are circumstances when you do want short gates and you don't want the sequencer to modify the type of gate or trigger it's receiving. You just want it to pass it through. If you want to modify it, then use something like regate to do that. Now, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just play with it and you'll see what happens, and change these values and you'll notice how the envelope changes. I'll give it a go here. I'm not sure you'll hear much difference in this particular one, but let's see. So that's the full length gate at the moment. Now I've turned off the gate and nothing's playing basically. You can hear just a very soft bit of envelope. There you go. It's not letting the envelope fully open before it closes. Now if I switch that back to the original setting, now the envelope has a full chance to open and close because of the type of gate it's receiving here. And that's the difference that I'm talking about. Okay, so that's the first basic voice. It's a bass sort of thump sound, if you like, to give some foundation and depth to the patch. Now let's look at the second part, the second bass voice that's playing the same notes as the first one. So here's the first bass voice just here, and then this here, this 4 modules here, these are playing the second bass part. So let me just let you hear that, and then I'll discuss how I created it. So you can hear it's got this sort of like rhythmic quality to it. And what it actually is the exact same voice. So these three modules here are repeated. I just duplicated them and made them exactly the same. But the difference is that cornrows, I've set its transpose to be 1 octave higher. So this bass sound is 1 octave higher than this bass sound. Even though it's playing the same pitches coming from the PS16, it's an octave higher. And I use this control here to change the octave. So on this one I set it an octave down, and this one I set the octave as 0. So together we get an octave spread, a much deeper bass sound here and a higher bass sound here. But then there's also this rhythmic quality to it. And to create that, I use the new hair pick from Frozen Wastelands, which is a sort of comb filter, but a comb filter with a twist. And that is that the cycle for the comb filter is clockable. So basically, you can synchronize how long it takes to do something in comparison to the clock that you feed it. So it becomes musically and rhythmically in sync with the rest of your piece. So in this case, I fed it a standard clock, but I've divided it by 4 using the division knob here. So basically, for every 4 clocks, it does its cycle. Then I've used a pattern, in this case the Fibonacci pattern, to give it that effect, which is the rhythmic quality of the comb filter. And then I've used a feedback type, which in this case is the default guitar, and I'm feeding it a mono input. You can see here's the output coming from the envelope, and this is actually a VCA in the envelope, so an amplifier, which is one of the great things about the slap envelope, but it actually has its own built-in amplifier, so I don't need a separate VCA. And that's going into the left input of the hair pick, but I'm taking 2 outputs, left and right, into my mixer, which are panned hard left and right. And this gives a very interesting extra texture to the bass sound. It's duplicated, so it's an octave higher, but then you've got this rhythmic quality. Now, there's also one other bit that I'm using to modify the sound of that second bass voice. And what it actually is that I don't want it playing all the time throughout the patch. So what I've done is I've taken, and you can see here, I've connected 2 cables. These are the 2 channels that the bass sound is, the second bass sound is coming through. This is the first bass sound, and this is the second. And I've taken 2 cables from the level inputs on console, and this is one of the reasons why I love using console, because it has all these CV-able functions, and taken those and fed them right from a clock. So from a LFO. So if you watch very carefully here, you'll see that if I run over, you'll see here that this output here of this particular LFO is connected to both the left and right channels of the console through its level input. So what this means is the LFO will modulate the volume level of these 2 voices, bringing them up and down at a sort of cyclic random way. So they don't play at the same volume level all the time, but they'll fade in and out of the mix when the track is playing. Now, to show you what that sounds like, I'm going to turn on the third, the original bass voice, the third channel here, basses, and then I'm going to start it playing, and what you should hear is the original bass sound, that deep whop, and then that bass voice fading in and out over time with it. there is that bass bit quite loud now, and now it's going to fade back into the distance, just leaving the original bass part playing. Yeah, now that second part is completely faded out. And then as the LFO goes back through its cycle, it will start coming back in again. Now, I do that because it gives texture to the piece. It's not parts playing constant volume levels all the way through. And I find that as a technique I use a lot to give movement and variety to my patch. Just a simple thing like using an LFO to fade up and fade down a particular track or tracks. And often I'll do that with multiple tracks with LFOs running at different speeds. So different parts rise up and down in volume level in comparison with other parts, so it sounds like you're mixing by hand, bringing volume levels of certain tracks up and down in comparison to other ones, so you get this constant movement and changing, sort of evolving sound from the patch, rather than it being all the tracks all the time at the same volume level. I also use a similar method to change panning of a track, and I'll come to that in a little while, but it's the same basic idea, using an LFO to pan a sound left and right at random in a sort of cyclic format, so that your stereo image changes throughout the patch too. But anyway, so those are now the two bass voices playing together. And as I said, I'm also using a sequence line, which I'm going to look at now. And again, this is one sequence, although I'm sort of cheating a little bit, because really it is two, but it's the same sequence to play the upper parts. So let's take a listen at the upper parts together without the bass part, and then I'll break down how I made those parts. So let's have a look at how I created the two lead synth sounds. And here they are. This is the first voice here, and this is the second voice here. And again, I'm going to play them individually so you can hear what the first voice, this one, sounds like. See, it's a 16-step sequence, and I'm using the PS32 here in 2x16 mode, so that means it's playing two different 16-step sequences, and I'm just using the first 16-step sequence to go through this cornrows X, and again a ferox and a slap. So here's the output here, going into a bog audio stack, and then the output going to the volt per octave input of his cornrows. And again, I'm using the bog audio stack because I'm going to be using the phrase seek 16, those bass notes that I showed you earlier, and they're coming up through this chord into the quantized input here to transpose the sequence. So you can hear it plays every 16 steps, and then it changes to a different scale, if you like, a different root note. So it's just one 16-step sequence repeating over and over again, but being transposed every time it plays the complete 16 steps. Now I'm also just going to turn off the reverb and the echo, and that's the basic sound I'm using. Now, I don't know if you can hear, but the tone of the sound is also changing. And I'm doing that by using an LFO into the color input for this particular voice, which is fold. And when I do that, and here it is over here, as that LFO cycles, it increases and decreases the color parameter, which changes the tone of the sound of this particular waveform. And that's another technique I use a lot, is that I use LFOs to modulate the parameters of my VCO or my filter, or even my envelope at times, as I'll show you later on. And this stops the sound being really stagnant. It stops it being exactly the same for every note. It changes it by small amounts, so the sound constantly changes and evolves as it's playing, which gives it more movement in a sequence. And again, by using reverb and some echo or delay, this brings out the sequence even more and stops it being that stale, stagnant sound. Just brings it alive. And to me, the use of reverb and delay are essential parts to most sequences. Actually, reverb is almost essential for almost every synth voice, as really dry synth sounds have their uses, but if the whole mix is dry, it just sounds sort of dead and got no feel or emotion involved in it. Doesn't really feel like you're listening to something that's, I don't know, sort of got some depth to it. So using the reverb to add to the sound, to me, is almost an essential part of every voice. And of course, as I've explained in other videos, I use Blamsoft's XFX reverb simply because, in my opinion, it's the best there is at the moment. I haven't come across a reverb that sounds as good as the Blamsoft, or I should say is as variable as the Blamsoft. There are some reverbs that can sound really good, but to actually have a huge range of tones and reverb effects, for me, the Blamsoft one is the one to have. And yeah, it's a paid-for plugin, but it's absolutely worth it in my mind. And then for delays, I use the Stereo Delay Plus from AS. It's free and it's a great delay unit. So that's the basic voice that I'm using. And again, I'm using the filter here with some with an envelope triggering that sound, a little bit of drive to it, not much. And I'm using the resonance here, again being modulated by an LFO. So the resonance increases and decreases, which again changes the tone somewhat of the sound. It stops it from being stagnant. So not only am I modifying the color, but I'm adding resonance to the filter sound as it's playing. And these two in combination give the basic sound some movement across the period of a sequence. Now, I've also got a second sequence running. And the second sequence is actually a little bit of a cheat. So what I did was I duplicated the first sequence and copied it using the copy and paste function into the second sequence. So these two initially were identical. But then what I did was I used the rotation command here and rotated this second sequence 2 steps to the right. So what does that mean? Well, if you take a series of numbers instead of pitches, and this sequence is actually made up of just 4 repeating sequences of pitches. In this case, it's actually G, C, D, G, with the G here being an octave higher. So it's C, D, G, octave higher, C. G. And what I did here is when I copied it is I moved the sequence to the right. So if this was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, this was originally 1, 2, 3, 4, but I moved the whole sequence 2 steps to the right. So instead of playing 1, 2, 3, 4, it plays 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. The same pitches, but they're moved over. So this was G, C, D, G an octave higher, and now this is D, G an octave higher, G an octave below, C. And because of that, you get this combination. It's like little chords, almost like open chords, between the 2 sequences playing together. So this is what the second sequence sounds by itself. Now you'll notice that it's also higher, and that's because I used the Bog Audio stack here for this voice to increase it by 1 octave. So not only is it playing, being rotated 2 to the right, it's also playing an octave higher. And you'll also hear it's being panned left and right. And that's because I took an output from another LFO over here and gave that to the input for the pan for this channel. This is channel 2 where this sound is coming through. And I put the LFO into here bi mode rather than uni, because this means that the sound pans full to the right and full to the left. So instead of being unipolar, this is bipolar. And what that means is unipolar starts at 0 and goes to, say, a value of 100 and then goes back to 0. Bipolar doesn't go from 0 to 100. It would go from minus 100 through 0 to plus 100 and then back down to minus 100. So it sort of doesn't start at the center in terms of panning. If I had used it in unipolar mode, it would start dead center and go all the way to the right and then back to dead center. In bipolar mode, it will start all the way to the left and then go all the way to the right and then go all the way back to the left again, giving that full pan across the stereo spectrum. And then I've also used another LFO to raise and lower the volume so it fades in and out compared to the first sequence, which plays all the time. So now let's listen to those 2 sequences together and you'll hear this happening. Oh, and the voices for the second sequence are identical to the voices for the first, just again 1 octave higher, and also I'm using the LFOs to fade them in and out and pan them left and right. Now if I add a bit of bass drum to this, to give it the rhythmic foundation, you'll hear how it all fits together. And I've used another trick on the bass drum as well, which I use a lot. This is the bass drum being played absolutely straight on the beat. But what I've done is added a little bit of delay to it, and I'm using this triplet delay setting, which is the default 375 and 750 when your tempo is at 120 BPM. It only works when your tempo is at that, or at 60 BPM or 180 BPM, a division of this. But at 120, these are exactly the right settings for that triplet type delay. And when I increase the delay, you get that sort of galloping swing sort of bass drum. Dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum ticka dum. And I don't want too much of it, just a little bit. But again, it just gives some movement to the piece. Now if I add the sequence back in, that's the first upper one. Now the second one, which will be fading in and out and moving left and right, and is an octave higher. And is shifted 2 steps to the right. So it's playing like a delay of the original one, 2 steps behind. Now I'm going to add in the original first bass voice. Oops. That one. Sorry. There's the original bass voice. And you can hear how that bass voice is the bass note of the transposition being used here. And that transposition is just simply taking the CV output of the lower PS16 and feeding it into the quantized inputs on both of these Bog audios, which are changing the pitch being sent to the corn roses up here. Now finally I'll add in the other bass voice to give the full mini patch. And there you can hear the patch starting to evolve as different parts become louder and softer, or pan left and right, or the sound itself starts to change. So there you go, there's a breakdown of this small mini patch. And this patch demonstrates a lot of the techniques I use when I build my mega patches. And in a lot of the patches I do build, I use many of these techniques, especially the transposition one, the panning ones, the modulation of the parameters ones, because it all gives the sequence movement and a feeling that it's not just the same sounds all the time playing through it, but that things are changing over time, which again makes the patch more interesting and the sounds more interesting. And that, I think, is an important part of a lot of patches that I make, is that I try and make them sonically interesting and not just the same thing repeating over and over and over again, but so that over time you get these different tones and flavors and things happening. And it's something that I've used a lot, and I learned this technique with hardware when you've only got a few modules and you don't have hundreds of different copies of things, so you have to modulate stuff and modify stuff to make a patch sound different when it loops, simply because you've got a limitation of the amount of hardware you've got. Otherwise your patches just sound really stale and the same after a couple of minutes of playing. So anyway, those are those techniques that I've used in this patch, and now we're going to look at a different sort of patch and some different techniques that I use. Before I carry on, I often get asked the question, who and what inspires me? And in the past, I would have run off a stream of names, people like William Orbit, David Sanchez, Kate Bush, Daniel Lanois, David Rhodes, Tony Levin, Manu Katché. I mean, just all the people that I listen to, Radiohead, and you name it. And that was always true. But in the last, I don't know, say year, what's inspired me most is you guys. The music that you've created in VCV Rack that I listen to, and when some of you upload your patches, and trust me, that's really appreciated when you do so. I can dissect the patches and look at them and say, how on earth did he do that? Or how on earth did she do that? Or how did he create that sound? Or how did she get that interaction going? And it's amazing what I've learned and what's inspired me by just listening to you guys and your music and dissecting what you've done and saying, wow, that's really interesting. That's really creative. And the same goes with developers. If it wasn't for people like, developers like Impromptu Modular or Volt or AS or South Pole or Frozen Wastelands or, Martin and ML or any of the sort of developers that work so hard on producing these modules for us, they all inspire me by what they've created to push myself forward and learn all this stuff and use it in my music. And I don't really think many of you understand just how inspiring your work really is for everyone else. It's something that goes unsaid in many ways, but honestly, you guys are the reason why I'm making music again at the moment, using VCV Rack, because every time I listen to something, it may not be my perfect cup of tea as far as what I like, but I can't think of a piece in recent times that I haven't looked at and gone, wow, that was interesting. How did they do that? How did that module create that type of sound? How do you use that with this to get that? And so, I really want to thank everybody out there for posting up your music, posting up the patches in particular, and just all the developers for all the hard work that you've put into this. And of course, Andrew and the VCV Rack team themselves for making this all possible. I don't think I say enough just how thankful and how appreciative I really am for everything you guys do. So just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to everybody who submits stuff to listen to, posts up on the Facebook page, on Patch Storage, on YouTube. Just, it's amazing. Please carry on doing that. As I know I personally, and I know many other people, get so much inspiration and ideas from you guys. So just carry on, and just know that many of us out there really thank you for everything you do. Okay, so enough of that, and now on with the next patch technique. And what I've done in this patch is, well, let me let you listen to it in the first place, and then I'll explain what's going on. So if you look at this is really quite a simple patch. It's just one VCO, one filter, one envelope, an LFO, and a single sequence running. But if you notice during that, the sound was changing in ways. And again, this is using modulation. But in this particular patch, I use modulation in a slightly different way. And what I've done is, and this is a technique I use a lot, is use an LFO here to modulate the release time of an envelope. Now, there are many envelopes out there, ADSRs, and SLAP is one of them, that have a CV or control voltage input that allows you to change the envelope on the fly as the piece is playing. So what this one does is, as the LFO cycles through, it makes the release time longer and shorter over time. And this is a really neat little trick which can add a lot of variety and change to your sound, because when it's linked to a filter, like in this case to the cutoff filter of the CMOS, then this opens and closes the filter in different ways and for different time frames and periods, which gives a lot of textural change to what is in essence a very simple sequence. And to let you hear that work, what I'm going to do is turn off the LFOs by disconnecting these two cables. And now I'll play the sequence and then I'll connect them up. And you'll notice that this LFO is altering this envelope, and this LFO is connected to the resonance input of the CMOS filter, so it's changing the resonance over time. And I'll play it and then connect up the cable so you can hear the difference. So here is the basic sequence without any modulation other than the envelope modulation going to the cutoff of the filter. So now I'm going to connect one of the LFOs to the resonance input of the CMOS filter. And I turn the resonance all the way down, but increase the CV input to almost full. So that adds some dirtiness, because of the way the Ferox is, it adds some grit and dirtiness to the sound that comes in and goes away again over time. Now I'm going to take the LFO output from the first LFO and connect it to the envelope, the release setting for the envelope. See how that changes things. these two LFOs are at different rates, then the resonance and the envelope changing is constantly evolving, happening at different times. So each time it loops through, it's playing a different combination of the two, giving a different effect, which means that, again, the sound isn't sterile. It just sort of evolves and changes over time. And so that's how I use an LFO to affect envelopes, which again is another technique I use in a lot of my patches, and one that I find gets some very interesting effects going very quickly and in a very simple way. Now in this patch, I'm going to be using an LFO to modulate something completely different. And that is, I'm going to use the LFO to modulate the tempo of a piece. Now, I've done this to a much wider degree than normally I would. But the point of doing this is that typically when people play in a band or in a group, the tempo doesn't stay exactly the same. It's not machine-like. It will sometimes increase a little bit, decrease a little bit. If you're in an orchestra, then you've got accelerando and rantaladandos to do. And again, music is not necessarily meant to be absolutely rigid and to the tempo. You can change tempos over time. And sometimes I use this technique to speed up a tempo from a slow start to a faster start, or to slow down from a fast tempo to a slow tempo at the end of a piece or the end of a phrase, or just vary the tempo every now and again just to give it a more human feel rather than an electronic, rigid, on the beat feel. And again, there are uses for that rigid beats, no doubt about it. But when you want to create something a little bit more human sounding, not quite as rigid, then this is one technique that I use. And to create this, what I've done is used an LFO and the Metro clock from CF, because this clock has an CV-able BPM value. In other words, when I feed an output from an LFO into the Metro's BPM input, the BPM will change in sync with the LFO. So if you look at this value here, you'll see that it gets faster and then it will slow down a bit. Oh, it's slowing down now, and then it will gradually slow down to a minimum value and then start going back up to the high value again. Now, I've made this quite an extreme difference so you can hear it, but I've used an attenuverter here. And what's the attenuverter used for? Well, to limit the upper and lower ranges. So what I've done is I've used these two controls to make sure that this doesn't go from zero, no tempo, to maximum tempo. What this is doing is just choosing a range, in this case about 130 BPM to 180 BPM, and I'm limiting it using these two controls. And how do you do that? Well, the way I do it is this. I set the attenuverter, the amount, to 0, and then I set the offset here to a value, like for example 140 BPM. Okay, and I'm going to turn the LFO to bipolar, so that means it will go up from the default a small amount and then go down past this point, lower, and then speed back up again. So if I set this to say 140 BPM, there's 140 BPM. So now I'm going to play this sequence and I'm going to add a little bit of attenuversion to it. So it's going to allow the tempo to go up a little bit in time with the LFO and down a little bit in time with the LFO, like this. So there's the piece playing at straight 140 BPM. Now by adding a little bit of attenuation here, 135, 134, and now it'll go up by the same amount past the 0 point, which in this case was 140. So it should get to about 147, maybe. Yep, 147. So it's gone up 7 and it's gone down 7 from the central point. If I add more attenuation, it will get faster and slower. And I'll speed up the LFO so it happens faster. It'll get even faster and get even slower in cycles. Speed up the LFO and the rate of change will be even greater. I typically use it just for small amounts. Just to give it a sort of a slightly more random feel. And using this as the master clock, I send the output from here to my clock dividers so everything stays in time. And so the purpose of that is just to give some random, slightly more human feel. And you know, you can use very small amounts, or you could use a square tooth like this as an LFO so that the tempo rises and doesn't fall. It just rises up and then stop the LFO. I typically use like the BPM LFO from Frozen Wastelands for that, because what it does is it allows me to stop and start the LFO remotely using a trigger, and so the basic tempo will start slow, increase to a high point, and then it's frozen at that point, and from then onwards the song plays at that fast tempo. So it's a great way of introducing tempo changes into your patch. Just experiment it and see how you get on, but it's really quite a simple thing to do, but again can make a big change to your patch. Now this is a variation on the last patch. I have the same sequence running here, again using the metro, going up and down in tempo. But what I've also done here is added another sequence, exactly the same as the first, but this one's staying at a steady 140 BPM. So what we'll actually have is two sequences playing. One will stay at the tempo and one of which will vary the tempo around it. And it's sort of like a constantly varying echo that can give some textural difference. And so I'll let you hear what that sounds like, and then you'll understand how it works. So just by changing the volume level of the one that's modulating, it gives this interesting sort of constantly evolving delay. Where sometimes the delayed part is behind the beat and sometimes it's in front of the beat. speed up the LFO, which is the speed of sort I normally use it at, you can now see the tempo is changing around that original one. And again, it's just a different sort of effect to use, and you can use this in lots of ways. I sometimes use this technique when playing slow sustained parts, and I double up the voices to give a thickness to the sound where not all the voices are playing exactly on time at the same time. Sometimes they are, sometimes one's ahead of the other, slower than the other, and it just gives a bit more human feel to it. Now for this next patch, what I'm going to demonstrate is what I call the cascade sequence effect. And this is an idea that I got from watching Steve Reich do something in the 90s. And at the time I only had 2 sequences in my hardware, and so I couldn't really reproduce what he does. But now I've got the capability of having multiple sequences and multiple synth voices, then I can reproduce the sort of thing that he does on occasion. And what it is very simply this. I've got 6 sequences playing 6 patterns of different lengths. So for example, this sequence is playing a 4-step pattern over and over again. You see 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern. This one is playing 5 steps at a time and then looping. And this one's playing 6 steps at a time and looping. This one's playing 7 at a time and looping. This one is playing 3 at random. So it's sort of playing one of 3 possible notes at random. And this one is playing fundamentally a 9-step sequence. So it plays 9. So we've got 4 steps, 5, 6, 7, 3 and 9. And each one is outputting 2. In this case, the new macro oscillator 2, which I have to say, for 20 bucks is an absolute steal. And there's an amazing mine of different sounds, textures and so on. Love this module. So I'm using it a lot in my recent patches. And each module is generating a slightly different sound. And not only are they generating different sounds, but I've panned them in different ways in the stereo image. So each basic voice has got its own place and its own sequence and its own time frame within the entire piece. And what I've done is I've used most of the notes are similar notes, similar pitches, just done in different sequences. So they all fit together when they play together, giving this sort of round and round waterfall cascade type effect. Let me give you an example. So I'm going to just unmute the first voice, which is the 4 steps playing over and over again. So that's the first sequence, and I've added delay and I've added reverb. But notice that I've also turned off the original voice. So all we're hearing is the affected voice, and this is another technique. It gives a different feel. If I turn on the original voice, you get that very hard attack thing with everything else behind it. But turning it off in this way softens that voice. So all you're doing is hearing the sound after it's passed through the reverb and the delay, but you're not hearing the original sound at all. So that original sound is no longer being output, just the affected sound. Now I'll add the second voice to it. because they're at different lengths, each time they play around, the notes come together in a different order. Now I'll have the third voice. And the fourth voice. And now we'll have the sixth voice. And notice I'm playing that one at a different tempo. So it's half the speed of the other sequences. And it's also 9 steps long. And then the final voice, which is the fifth voice, is actually set 2 octaves below for a bass, and it's only playing the choice of 3 different notes in random order. Now, to make that more interesting, what I'm going to do is add an LFO. So I'll go to my AS LFO and I'll use the tri LFO because it gives me 3 of them. And I'm going to feed those one by one into the levels like this. So that's the first 3 set up. And now I need another LFO. So I'll duplicate that and take 3 more, but I don't want the bass note to change volume. I want it to stay the same, so I'm not going to alter its level. Well, yeah, no, I'm going to leave that one the same for the time being. And then I'm going to set up the LFO to have different times, so they're all working at different speeds, like this. There we go. So I've got 5 different speeds that these sounds are going to go up and down in volume. And by doing this, we now get these really interesting ways of things mixing together. It's like an automatic mix. And it sounds something like this. And suddenly, from a piece that was like all notes playing all the time and quite busy, now suddenly it's become this delicate sort of changing thing. And again, if I add another LFO, move it down here so you can see it, and I'm just going to do some of these. Hang on a second, let me just change the values a little bit, and I'll make them bipolar because I'm going to use these to change the panning of some of the voices. So I take a pan output and connect this. Set these to center, create another LFO because I want some more panning. I'll put this one on here so you can see it. Change the rate again, and I'll just add these to this channel and finally this one. And now the sounds will start to pan left and right in time with the LFOs, and also at a different pace to the pitch coming up and down. Now if I add the original sound, you'll hear everything panning. There we go. Now we have a piece that's changing in volume level, changing in panning, and constantly evolving in the pitches it's playing together. And again, this is a technique that I use a lot in my patches, this idea of making things self-evolve, self-mix, self-pan. I'll change the envelopes by LFOs or by other random means, which I'll demonstrate in a little while. But the whole point of this is to stop your patches sounding stagnant and sterile, but just to add lots of different flavors to them that change as the pieces go along. Now, again, this doesn't work for every sort of patch. Sometimes you want very rigid things, you know, a fixed position and everything else, and that's great. But when you're trying to do sort of self-playing, self-generating, self-creating patches, this is one way of just getting very different feels to the entire patch. Just simply using some LFOs and step sequences that have a different number of steps in each to create that sort of effect. And you can change the tempo of some of these sequences, like I've just speeded up this one. And now you can hear it playing twice the tempo. And again, that gives it a different feel. And there's it back to its original speed. Now playing 4 times the original speed. Again, just as a different technique, and you can change whichever sequence you want just by switching them over like this. And again, it just adds variety to the sound. And you could use the CF clock that I demonstrated in a previous batch to change the tempos of these things rather than do this. Or use sequential switches to change and select between different tempos and automate those as well. So each part plays a different tempo every so often. So there's some more sort of ideas using tempos and creative use of volume and panning through pitches, but also this whole sequence thing of having different pattern lengths, creating constantly evolving sequences as you go through. Okay. For this last part of this episode of TR, I want to look at how you can use gate or triggers to control your sequences, and again add variety or control or manipulation to sequences. And in this instance, what I'm doing is I'm using a GateSeek 64 GS64 to send gate signals to the run input of the PS32. Now let's play the sequence as it is without any gates. So it's just a straightforward 4-step sequence. Now what's going to happen when I start this sequence is, every time it sends a gate, it will start the sequence from running, and then when it receives the next gate, it will stop it from running. Start it, stop it, start it, stop it, start it, stop it, start it. Keep it going for 2 steps and then stop it for 2, and you'll hear what happens. So now I've introduced this sort of rhythmic stuff to it, but you could also use this to turn sequences on and off during a piece. If you use a very slow gate here, for a very slow clock for the GS64, you could time it so a sequence will start playing at a certain point in a song and stop playing it at a certain point. Now, as a variation on what I just did, here, this time I'm using the GateSeek. Instead of stopping and starting the sequencer, I'm going to mute the channel, the mixer channel where the sound is coming from. So this will provide sort of gating effects on the sound. So here it is without the gating effect. And now I'll connect this to the mute input, and you'll hear the gating effect being created by the GS64. So now I'm getting these rhythmic things that are coming from a straightforward 4 to the floor sequence, but I'm getting all these different rhythmic patterns from the same sequence. And again, this is a technique I use a lot, using gates from a sequencer or sometimes from an LFO, just to change the rhythmic quality and the rhythmic sense of a straightforward sequence. So at any time I could be, for example, playing the first sequence and then during the song automate so it plays the second gate sequence, which changes the rhythmic part of the track altogether. And this can create all sorts of interesting and different rhythmic capabilities simply from a straightforward 4 to the floor sequence. A 16-step sequence can become all sorts of different things. And again, depending on which notes, which gates you send and when, you could have different notes from the sequence playing at certain times and then switch to other ones later, again with different rhythmic values. And on to the last patch for this episode. And this one is sort of a follow-on from the previous two, but slightly different. A lot of people don't seem to realize that you do not have to feed a sequencer, for example, with a steady clock. In other words, you don't have to make a sequencer go dop, 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 as a rigid clock is fed to it. Some sequencers, and the ones from Impromptu Modular are a good example of this, can take what we call irregular clocks. That is, that they will take a step forward with every clock signal they receive, but those clock signals don't have to be in a steady stream. They could be rhythmic. So to give you an example of what I mean, I've set up a gate seek 64, actually a pair of them, and each 16-step pattern is playing a different rhythm. So you've got 4 here and 4 here. And these 4 are playing at 1 tempo, and these 4 are playing at twice the tempo, double the incoming clock. And then what I've done is I've taken each output and fed that to a sequential switch, an 8 to 1 from ML. I love these two switches. It does an 8 to 1 and a 1 to 8, and they're really useful for all sorts of things. So I fed the outputs of the gate to the 8 inputs on the sequential switch, and then the output for the switch goes to the clock input of the sequencer. Now, I could manually press these to change it, or I could send it a clock so it would change every so often and step through. But you can use a sequential switch, especially Martin's, in a very different way, and that's what I love about it. You can send it note values, in other words voltages, which is basically what pitches are. You can send that to the step input and program which of these switches you want to come on in which order. So you can basically sequence this sequential switch, so you can play things at different times. So you can play 2 bars of switch number 1 followed by a bar of switch number 3 followed by 3 bars of switch number 6, and so on. And you can do this with sequential switches with this particular one for all sorts of purposes. But I'm using it like this just to show you the different sorts of rhythms I've got by sending different clock rhythms to the SMS16, which is this all-in-one sequencer and synth in one package. Really useful little module for putting together quick patches and also for beginners, because basically it sets itself up automatically with no wiring, so you can just start programming, take an output from the LP here, the low pass, put it to a mixer or straight to your audio card, and you've got an instant synth voice that you can play with. Anyway, let's listen to what this sequence sounds when it's playing a straight clock. So there's just a straightforward every clock being sent in normal order. And in fact what I'm doing is I'm using this pattern here from the GS64. So it's playing a straight every beat, just like a normal clock would. Now I'm going to run the sequencer here to send different values to the switch. So it will start using different ones of these patterns. In other words, it will route one of these through the switch and to the clock, like this. Watch here, each of these steps is choosing a different pattern, in other words a different switch, which is allowing a different pattern to pass through. Moment is now playing sequence number 4, which is this one. Now it's playing sequence number 6, which is this one. And so this becomes a really simple way of being very creative with synth patterns. You have the same notes running in the sequencer, but you're assigning different rhythms to it through a sequential switch, which is then choosing them depending on what value you're sending from the PS16. And again, you know, this is an experimentation thing. Take the output from the PS16 and I put it into an attenuverter to try and minimize the ups and downs of it. In other words, it just makes it a little bit easier to manage. Then from there to the step input, and so when this value changes here, this changes the value that the switch is pressed, basically. So a certain note like C in C4 will play switch number 4, C7 will play switch number 8, C0 or C1 will play switch number 1. And you just have to experiment by clicking on the notes to see which notes change the switch to which number, and then program a sequence using those appropriate notes. Simple method, works really well, and yeah, I really do like the SMS16. It's got some pretty beefy sounds to it. Again, if you beef it up a little bit using a bit of reverb and a bit of delay, it's quite a thumpy little synth. So there you go. There's a few patches, a few ideas, a few things to try out. And in the next episode of Talking Rackheads, I'm going to be doing a few more of these, and maybe then we'll start to build the actual big mega patch using some of the ideas, or as many as I can, from what I've shown you into that patch. Now, this week there will not be a patch playout. I simply haven't had time to do one. Creating all these patches actually used up all my available time. So, no worries, there'll be one next week, I'm certain. But listen, have a great 2 weeks. I will see you all again 2 weeks on Wednesday, today. Hopefully this will go out on Wednesday. And if you've got any questions, got any comments, please fire them off to me either on the Facebook page or in the YouTube comments section. And if you've got any ideas of sequence things that, could be done that I haven't thought of, please, send some patches to patchstorage.com or upload them to Facebook and let me know and I'll try them out. And if I find any ones that I haven't seen before or I think really good, and typically most of them are, then I'll implement them and put them on to the next episode of Talking Rackheads 2. So you could see your patch appear on there as well. Okay, guys, as I said, have a great 2 weeks. Enjoy your time with VCV Rack, and know that I look forward to seeing you all again. Take care. Be safe.